The air was thick with silence. A grey January sky hung over London in 1649, heavy as judgment itself. At the centre of the crowd, a scaffold draped in black. Upon it, a man once anointed by God, now condemned by men. The masked executioner raised the blade, and in that single suspended breath before the fall, the city seemed to stop breathing. A thud, then a roar, part relief, part horror. The head of Charles Stuart, King of England, rolled into history. They said it was politics that killed him, that Parliament rose against tyranny, that religion tore the nation apart. But history, when you peel back the proclamations and the sermons, whispers another truth, one written not in scripture or law, but in ledgers and gold, because before the war, before the rebellion, before the cries for liberty and justice, there was a debt, a desperate king, and a bribe. It began quietly, as these things always do. A letter sealed in wax, a sum promised in secret, a favor traded in shadows, a transaction meant to save a crown that instead bought its destruction. Charles was no stranger to financial peril. His wars were costly, his taxes unpopular, his coffers perpetually dry. But what happens when a ruler believes his divine right extends to credit? When loyalty becomes another form of currency, and men of honor learn the price of betrayal? The answer came in silver, in silence, and in blood. For centuries, the story has been told as a clash of ideals: monarchy versus parliament, king versus people. But what if the true battle was between creditors and debtors? Between a sovereign who borrowed beyond his means and the financiers who realized they could make or break a kingdom? Imagine it. One deal, one exchange, one gift, too tempting to refuse. A nobleman paid to look the other way. A general whose loyalty was negotiable. A foreign banker whispering promises of solvency at a cost. History remembers rebellion as righteous. But rebellion, like everything else, must be funded. And those who fund it do not do so out of faith, but profit. Charles believed his crown was eternal. His enemies knew better. They understood that power, real power, lies not in divine right, but in the right investment. And when the ledgers no longer balanced, neither did the kingdom. In the end, the axe did not fall because of faith or freedom. It fell because of a debt unpaid. Because someone, somewhere, decided the king was no longer worth the cost. This was the bribe that cost a king his head. Welcome to the Financial Historians, where money, history, and power collide. Every revolution has a slogan, every rebellion a cause. But beneath the banners and the blood, there is always a balance sheet. Kings rise by divine right, but they fall by economic failure. Empires are not toppled by swords alone, but by debts, shortages, and deals struck in desperation. And behind every act of treason, there's someone counting the profit. The English Civil War is remembered as a struggle for liberty, Parliament against the Crown, faith against tyranny. But what if the real story was about liquidity? What if the first modern revolution was not sparked by ideology, but insolvency? Charles I was not the first ruler to run out of money, and he would not be the last. But few gambled as recklessly with power, or misunderstood as completely the price of trust. In the 1630s, he ruled without parliament for 11 long years. The so-called personal rule. To the people, it looked like strength. To financiers, it smelled like weakness. Without parliament, there could be no new taxes. Without taxes, no revenue. Without revenue, the king turned to other means. He revived ancient taxes, sold monopolies, and squeezed his subjects for every shilling he could find. And yet, it was never enough. The wars in Scotland drained him, and rebellion simmered at home. The royal treasury was a leaking ship, and every desperate measure to plug it only opened new holes. So, when a group of wealthy merchants and nobles offered him a lifeline, discreet loans, quiet favors, and political support, Charles accepted. He told himself it was loyalty. They knew it was leverage. This is how power begins to rot. Not in open rebellion, but in whispered agreements. When influence is purchased, justice is leased, and loyalty becomes a line item on a ledger. The crown had gold-embroidered robes, but empty vaults. And as every merchant knows, an empty vault is an open opportunity. While the world saw a divine monarch ruling by sacred right, those in the shadows saw something else. A desperate man willing to trade favors for coin. A debtor king. And once a king owes money, he is no longer a ruler. He is a client. As the walls of debt closed in, Charles began making promises he could not keep, to his allies, to his soldiers, to his creditors. And somewhere in that spiral of obligation and betrayal, a single deal was made that would seal his fate. A deal so secret, so politically toxic, that its details were buried in coded letters and vanished ledgers. But the results were unmistakable. It turned allies into informants. It turned generals into traitors. And it turned a crown into collateral. Because, in the end, every throne rests not on faith or fear, but on finance. And when the money runs out, so does the monarchy. The deal that changed everything. In the winter of 1640, England's royal court glittered with ceremony, but behind the pageantry lay ruin. Charles the Martyr sat upon his throne, every inch a king, yet every inch in debt. His wars in Scotland, the bishops' wars, had drained the treasury. His subjects resented his taxes. His merchants, once loyal, now murmured of risk. The divine right of kings had never looked so fragile. He was trapped, by pride, by principle, and by numbers. So he did what rulers always do when the coin runs dry. He looked for new lenders. And that was when the deal was struck. It began not in Westminster, but in the smoky chambers of the City of London, the beating financial heart of the realm. A syndicate of merchants and moneylenders, many of them Puritan in sympathy but pragmatic in business, saw their opportunity. They would supply the king with funds, discreetly, of course, in exchange for privileges, monopolies, and lucrative state contracts. Charles accepted. He had no choice. But the terms were poison. He pledged future revenues, customs duties, ship money, even the profits of the royal forests, as collateral. He promised influence he could not afford to give. And worst of all, he believed he could outwit the men who financed him. He could not. Among the financiers was a man named Philip Berlamacci, a royal financier of Italian descent, trusted by kings yet loyal only to his own accounts. Berlamacci had once bankrolled Charles's father, James I. He knew the royal pattern: borrow, delay, and default. So he hedged his bets, quietly backing not only the king, but Parliament's emerging faction as well. This was the bribe within the bribe, a silent purchase of influence on both sides. If the king won, Berlamacci profited. If Parliament triumphed, he profited more. And it worked, for a time. The king's coffers refilled, his armies rearmed, and the pageantry of monarchy continued. But money is never loyal for long. When Charles defaulted on his loans, his financiers turned against him, freezing credit, funding his enemies, and whispering in the ears of men whose allegiance could be bought. A general short on pay begins to reconsider his cause. A nobleman, drowning in his own debts, begins to question divine right. A parliament, starved for revenue yet rich in outrage, sees its chance. The deal that was meant to save the crown instead built the scaffolding for its downfall. What began as a bribe to maintain power became a contagion of greed, infecting court, country, and command alike. By the time Charles realized it, it was too late. The financiers had become the true power behind the throne, and the king, proud and desperate, was now a debtor surrounded by his creditors. Men who understood that sometimes the surest way to rule a kingdom is to let it borrow itself to death. Perfect. Here's part 3, Act 2, the money behind the throne in the same cinematic, darkly dramatic tone. This section reveals how greed and finance corroded loyalty from within, turning England's court into a marketplace of betrayal. The money behind the throne. The English court had always been a theater, velvet, gold, and ceremony. But beneath the glitter, the whispers grew louder. Those who once bowed to the crown now counted their returns. The king's favor could be purchased for a price, and soon the realm itself began to resemble a ledger, its columns filled not with duty or devotion, but debt and speculation. Charles surrounded himself with advisors who promised solvency through cunning, loans from abroad, new taxes, or the sale of royal lands. But every coin borrowed came with a condition, and every lender came with a motive. To the merchants of London, the king was a liability. To the bankers of Amsterdam and Genoa, he was an investment. And to his enemies in Parliament, he was a man hanging by a thread of unpaid interest. The court became a bazaar of influence. Nobles traded titles for loans. Judges were bought to secure verdicts. Officers of the army went unpaid, until someone else paid them better. One by one, the pillars of monarchy began to fracture. Among them, Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford, the king's most trusted minister. Strafford had once been the architect of royal authority, the iron hand of a desperate monarch. But when Parliament accused him of treason, his allies melted away. Even the king's promise to protect him proved worthless, bought off by pressure, debt, and fear. Strafford's execution was not just a political sacrifice, it was a transaction, a human payment to buy Parliament's temporary mercy. Outside England, foreign agents watched with interest and open purses. France and the Dutch Republic, both eager to tilt the balance of English power, poured quiet money into the conflict. Gold crossed borders disguised as gifts, donations, and loans. In the shadows, war was becoming a business. The bankers of Amsterdam financed Parliament's army through hidden credit lines, using merchant guilds as cover. Scottish Covenanters received payments to rise against the king. And English nobles, cornered by debt, began selling loyalty like contraband. Each defection was not just ideological, it was transactional. Every betrayal had a price tag. The army Charles relied upon was no longer his own. Its wages came from Parliament's purse. Even his commanders, once sworn to royal service, began negotiating with his enemies, not for cause, but for compensation. And through it all, Charles clung to his image as a chosen monarch. He could not see that his throne had already been repossessed, piece by piece, payment by payment. The real sovereign now was not a man in robes, but the invisible hand of finance, a network of merchants, lenders, and agents who decided quietly who would win the coming war. The sword would decide the victor, yes, but gold had already decided the sides. By 1647, the English Civil War had dragged the kingdom into exhaustion. The banners of divine right lay tattered in the mud, and the king, once the image of God's authority on earth, was now a fugitive of his own debts. Charles I had lost his army, his capital, and his crown's credibility. But in his mind, he was still the king. Still bargaining, still negotiating, still convinced that one more deal could save him. So he did what he always had done. He made another promise he could not keep. Imprisoned, he opened secret negotiations with both Parliament and the Scots. To each, he offered money, titles, and trade privileges in exchange for their loyalty. And to each, he lied. The Scots wanted Presbyterian supremacy. Parliament wanted constitutional control. Charles promised both, taking money from one side to betray the other. The man who had once commanded armies was now gambling with promissory notes, and this time his creditors noticed. The Scots, realizing they had been deceived, sold him, literally sold him, to Parliament for $400,000. A king reduced to a financial transaction, a monarch traded like a debt security. It was the most humiliating sale in royal history. When Charles was brought to trial, it was not just his crimes that were judged, but his accounts. Every broken promise, every unpaid debt, every bribe that had bought him another day of power, now stood as evidence. The court called it treason. But beneath the rhetoric, the message was simple. He had bankrupted the realm, morally and financially. His judges were not revolutionaries. They were auditors, and their verdict was inevitable. On January 30th, 1649, Charles walked to the scaffold at Whitehall. He wore 2 shirts that morning, so that he would not shiver in the cold, lest the crowd think him afraid. He spoke calmly, still believing that death would restore his dignity. But even in that final moment, the irony remained. The executioner was paid. The king's death itself was a transaction. When the axe fell, England gasped, not only at the act, but at what it meant. The divine order was over. The monarchy had defaulted. In the days that followed, Parliament seized royal lands and melted down the crown jewels, selling fragments of kingship to pay the army that had killed him. Gold that once adorned his throne now lined the coffers of the men who had dethroned him. And those who had profited most from his fall, the lenders, the brokers, the speculators, quietly vanished into history, their ledgers clean, their fortunes intact. For a moment, they had owned England itself. The revolution, like the war, had been funded and paid for in full. Charles had believed power was eternal. His enemies knew better. They understood the oldest rule of all. When kings become debtors, kingdoms become commodities. History loves to disguise itself. It tells us that kings fall for love, for pride, for faith. But look closely, and you'll find the same fingerprints every time. Debt, greed, and the price of loyalty. The story of Charles I isn't just about monarchy. It's about markets, a divine right undone by double-entry bookkeeping, a revolution not merely of ideas, but of accounts. Because once money entered politics, once loans, bribes, and secret payments began steering the fate of empires, divine right was no longer divine. It was negotiable. Charles believed power flowed downward from God, but in truth, it was already flowing upward, toward those who financed it. Merchants, bankers, and moneylenders had discovered something revolutionary. You don't need to wear a crown to rule a king. You just need to own his debts. That's how modern power began, not in battlefields, but in ledgers. Every monarchy that followed learned this lesson, whether they admitted it or not. The French crown borrowed itself into bankruptcy and paved the road to revolution. The Spanish Empire collapsed under the weight of loans from Genoese financiers. Even the mighty Ottoman sultans, wrapped in silk and divinity, became dependent on foreign creditors. Every time, the pattern repeated: borrow, default, fall. Because corruption is not simply the exchange of money for favors. It's the quiet rewriting of who commands whom. Once money enters the bloodstream of power, it becomes impossible to extract. Charles's bribe, that first fatal deal, was not unique. It was the prototype. Look at the centuries that followed. 18th century ministers selling colonial monopolies to private investors. 19th century parliaments shaped by railroad barons and bankers. 20th century dictators financed by corporations. And today, lobbyists, super PACs, offshore accounts, and donations that rewrite laws before they're even signed. The instruments have changed. Coins replaced by contracts, gold by wire transfers, oaths by NDAs, but the mechanics are ancient. A king once sold his soul for solvency. Now, presidents and parliaments sell policy for campaign checks. Money, once a tool of power, has become its author. Consider the modern world. A senator's vote swayed by a donor. A corporation fined billions and then hired to write the regulations meant to restrain it. A nation's foreign policy bent by who finances its debt. The actors change, but the stage remains the same. The financiers of Charles's England knew something fundamental. Influence yields better returns than interest. Why settle for repayment when you can purchase obedience? And it worked. They reshaped England's government, its trade, its religion, all through the invisible machinery of credit. In their wake came the Bank of England, the bond market, and the world's first real financial state. A government funded not by divine will, but by perpetual debt. Out of Charles's failure was born the modern economy. His execution marked not only the death of a king, but the birth of capitalism as sovereign. That's the true legacy of 1649. The crown lost its head, and the market gained one. Today, when we talk about corruption, we often imagine suitcases of cash, secret meetings, or whispered deals. But the truth is subtler and far more dangerous. Corruption isn't always criminal. Sometimes it's simply normalized. It's when campaign donors become ambassadors, when billion-dollar bailouts rewrite the rules for those who paid for them, when corporations fund both sides of an election, the way monarchy once financed both king and parliament, ensuring they win no matter who loses. It's when we still call it democracy, but it feels suspiciously like debt collection. Because the question hasn't changed in 400 years. Who rules whom, the people or the money that buys them? Every age has its Charles, proud, unyielding, convinced of divine purpose. And every age has its monarchy, discreet, calculating, watching the throne tremble, waiting for the perfect moment to collect. Charles believed betrayal came from men, but betrayal comes from systems, from the slow corrosion of dependence. Until rulers no longer rule, they negotiate. That's the real warning buried beneath the dust of 1649. When governments depend on those they're meant to regulate, the axe is already being sharpened. It may not fall on a scaffold, but the result is the same. The public pays the price. Because bribery is not just a crime. It's the oldest form of financial warfare, and it wins not with armies, but with contracts. So when we read of the king's downfall, we're not just reading history. We're reading the prototype of every modern scandal, every donation, every favor, every deal whispered in corridors of power. The same game, different currency, and the same question echoing across centuries. Can loyalty survive a balance sheet? And when power becomes a purchase, who truly wears the crown? A crown may symbolize power, but in the end, It was a bribe that sent it rolling into the dirt. On that cold January morning, when the blade fell at Whitehall, the sound that echoed wasn't just the end of a monarch. It was the collapse of an illusion. The idea that power could ever stand apart from money. For Charles I, divine right was supposed to be unbreakable. But divine right doesn't pay armies. It doesn't finance loyalty. And it cannot compete with the quiet certainty of gold. The men who brought him down didn't yet need to shout in the streets or storm his palace. They only had to close their purses. And in doing so, they proved a timeless truth, that kings do not fall when they are hated. They fall when they are no longer profitable. The scaffold was only the final page in a long financial reckoning. What began as a bribe ended as a balance sheet written in blood. A monarch executed by the very system he failed to understand. But perhaps the greater tragedy is that he was not the last. Centuries later, the same pattern repeats. In palaces and parliaments, in boardrooms and ballot boxes, power still sells itself to survive. Influence is still a currency, and loyalty still has a price. The names change, the methods evolve, the justifications grow more sophisticated, but the story remains the same. Money whispers, power listens, and truth is the collateral. Charles's head rolled to the cheers of a crowd who believed they had slain tyranny. In time, many realized they had simply traded one master for another, a king of flesh for a king of finance. That is the ghost that still walks among us. Every time a policy is sold to the highest bidder, every time justice bends beneath the weight of a donation, every time those in power mistake debt for destiny, the shadow of that scaffold grows a little longer. History doesn't just record the wars we fought. It remembers the prices we paid. And sometimes, the cost is a king's head. So the next time we speak of corruption, remember Charles. Remember the bribe that began as salvation and ended as execution. Remember that behind every fall from grace, royal or republican, there is always a ledger somewhere, quietly balancing. Because in the end, money doesn't care who wears the crown. It only cares that someone will. If you've enjoyed uncovering the hidden deals that changed history, the debts, the betrayals, the prices paid in gold and blood, then join us. Subscribe to The Financial Historians, where money, history, and power collide, and where every coin has a consequence.